It's Winter Storm that's coming up, right?
It is, yeah.
That's the official name. Suddenly, now my mind is like searching, like, is it Kansas City Winter Storm, Kansas City Hornpipe? No, wait, that's the
It's
Fred
like
Morrison
M
tune.
half. It's M half Winter Storm. So
Is that what they call it?
Yeah, Midwest Highland Arts Fund, and then Winter Storm is just that's the name of it. I don't think Kansas City is officially attached to the name.
Yeah, I'm assuming that that's why Fred Morrison wrote that tune, though, right? The Kansas City Hornpipe.
I believe so.
It's a killer tune.
Does it have something to do with him getting caught in a storm and not being able to get there or something, or getting stuck there? Or I don't quite know.
I'd believe it. I don't know the backstory, but I know his Uilleann pipe version is killer. But in his book, he has a Highland pipe version. I don't know if you knew that, but he does, and it's great.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's great fun to play for sure. But speaking of Winter Storm coming up, Andrew, you yourself have judged. You yourself have played for many judges, and you know other judges.
Yeah.
What is a judge listening for in a solo competition?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it all depends on, it can depend on the judge, and it also really depends on what level you're listening to. So, the different solo competition grades go all the way from basically pure beginner all the way to ultra advanced. So depending on what level that is, I think what's really being listened for probably changes, or the specificity of it changes. But basically, you're listening to. A good way to boil it down would be that you're listening to the quality of the fingerwork technique, right? So grace notes and no crossing noises and embellishments and making sure everything's there. So that would be one of the things you're evaluating. You're probably listening to the quality of the instrument itself. So how well is it tuned? What quality of sound do you get out of the instrument? How steady is the person blowing? Those sort of things. It's going to go into the instrument evaluation. And then, on top of that, it's probably going to be the musical merit of what you're playing. So are you expressing the tune well? Are you presenting it in a way that the judge enjoys? And I think those three categories, some cocktail of those three things is what any judge is going to be listening for when they listen. And I guess right now I'm just speaking specifically to solo competition, but yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about, is specifically solo competition. The breaking it into three categories helps for me, like thinking like, what is it that I'm thinking about when it comes to finger work, do you feel like you're more listening for mess ups, or are you listening for really great execution? You know what I mean? And maybe that changes based on the level, but is it like, oh, well, they didn't screw up any of their F doublings, so good for them? Or is it like, wow, that was an amazing burl,
I feel like points. It's a good question. Like, so I think it's kind of like Jedis versus the Siths,
Sure.
That question. So so are you listening for faults, or are you listening for qualities? And I think the answer is a good judge is going to have to balance, the dark side of the force, and what is it? The light side? No, and the good side, the bright side.
Yeah, the bright side. That's it. I'm sure that's
what is
definitely
the other side?
the bright side.
Yeah, so I think a good judge is probably going to do both, and that's probably true at all levels. So I've heard like at Oban and Inverness, I've heard people miss technique, but still win some of the biggest prizes available on the face of the earth, right? So in that case, there were obvious faults in the technique, but there must have been aspects of the performance that were so good that they kind of balanced it out and it was forgivable, right? And then, I'm sure the opposite is also sometimes true, but yeah, coming up as a competitor, you always hated the bean counter judges.
Right.
The ones that would just list like, oh, you missed that grace note, missed doubling, small crossing noise, first place. Oh no. Or even worse, seventh place or something like that.
That's more to my experience there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it would be interesting. And then as someone who judges competitions, certainly in the more developmental levels, I'm interested in players that have really good technique. Like that's my primary interest. And then my secondary interest, it's, for me, it's secondary interest like if they had a bunch of misses or if they miss a lot of grace notes. And so, yeah, you have to carefully balance that as a judge. And as a listener, kind of listening to a solo competition, you can judge how you feel the different performances compare, and you can decide what you value as well, which is probably, it's probably worth thinking about.
Gotcha. So in the second bucket, then, when it comes to like playing steady and the instrument itself, right? Like, what comes to my mind is something similar to the anxiety that we probably have all. maybe this is too much, right? But the anxiety that maybe only I, but I suspect maybe all of us secretly have felt when in the pool. That like, is there that chemical in this pool that'll show if I pee right now? It'll
Right.
change colors.
Yeah.
Like, can a judge hear if I have not even looked at my drone reads in months? Like to what degree are my dirty secrets about bad maintenance going to come through in my performance for anybody at the level that they can be an accredited judge, or is it more just about blowing steady?
So the answer to that question is, I'm trying to bring it back to the pool analogy, but I'm struggling. The answer to that question is a good judge can absolutely 100% tell.
Yeah,
I would say.
Great.
And sometimes
Great.
you might manage to get your drones in tune with each other, but
Yeah.
like let's say they're too open and they're too loud and raucous. Like a judge is definitely going to pick up on that, and it's going to have a negative impact on the tonal quality, and then it's likely to impact, what a judge is going to think of that performance. Let's pretend like two performances were perfectly equal, except for one guy had one guy had the drone reads sort of, we use the word calibrated at the dojo, but like let's say the drone reads were set perfectly and in tune, and then the other ones were in tune, but the drone reads really weren't set perfectly. Well, all other things being equal, yeah, the judge can definitely tell. The
Yeah.
chemicals are definitely in that pool.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So-
But then, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll look the other way if there's a minor issue with that, just because other aspects of the performance are particularly noteworthy.
Sure, amazing finger work
positive
or
or the negative.
great expression or something. And when the bright side is so bright that it drives out some of the darkness, huh?
Right, exactly. Could be, or it could go the other way.
Right. So
Right.
kind of to the same end, like I think we like to think that during those first few minutes, like the tuning phase, like the judges somehow turn off their brains, so like they
Right.
can't hear us and they can't see us, but they obviously can. Like,
Yes.
if they're not taking notes on the paper, are they already taking notes in their head? Because like that's the moment when, like, for me, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Does Adrian Melvin think that it's a better idea to tune the outside tenor before the bass? Like I'm immediately in my head about like, am I even tuning up correctly, for my soloing?
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. So can we back up a smidge and just talk about what that is? Because I don't
Absolutely,
think a lot of
yeah.
people are clear on that. So in all bagpipe competition that I'm aware of, there's a allotted period of time that you're allowed to use for tuning. And that, I think that at first glance, you're probably asking the question, like, why is that necessary? Why don't people just show up with their pipes in tune
Yeah,
and then
just
start playing?
just walk out there and play. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think, I actually think that is kind of a reasonable thing. And I personally hope that the world goes in that direction someday, where it's like, where we can get rid of this. But traditionally, we allow this tuning time. And the issue there is that anyone who's played bagpipes at an intermediate level or beyond will start to notice that the bagpipe tuning changes over time, right? It doesn't stay the same. It doesn't stay the same particularly well. It's not like my digital piano that's always in tune, right? It's like the bagpipe's always going to change. Like if it's a little bit colder, the pitch is
Right.
going to kind of change. If it's a little bit warmer, the pitch might change.
Well, and
then
you
there's
know that like the judges table will be in the sun when it's time for you to
Yes.
play and stuff like that.
Exactly. And then so you're often changing environments from the tuning area to the playing area, and so on. And so so that period of time is really for the bagpipes to settle. Okay, so if you're curious about that, when you're watching a competition, especially a higher level one, that initial period of time, the piper might be playing a slow air, or they might just be playing a miscellaneous string of notes, or some combination thereof, and you'll see them occasionally reach up and tweak the drones. Like that's just the piper getting their instrument settled and ready to play for a specific period of time, where they're not allowed to touch their pipes after that point, right? So once your march starts or your pibroch starts, and think about a pibroch, right? It's very, very long in duration. So once that tune starts, you're not allowed to reach up and tweak your drones, which interestingly, historically, has not always been the case.
Really?
Which I found really interesting. Yeah. Like my understanding is like way back in the day, it was kind of expected that throughout the tune, you might reach up and tweak the tuning a little bit just to keep things.
Interesting.
But that's no longer a thing, and so for competition, you got to last the whole tune, which means that settling period is very, very handy. And the more advanced you get, the more discerning you are during that period of time, and the more strategy would be involved in getting the pipe settled. Okay, but anyway, back to your question, which was, do the judges evaluate the players during that period of time?
Right, yeah.
And so on paper, the answer is no. Judge not supposed to.
Yeah.
But then in reality,
they
of course,
are, right?
Definitely.
Like
Yeah,
if I pull my chanter out and like suck on my reed and pinch it or something right there in front of them, like what are they gonna say, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I remember Jack Lee educating me about this. Like basically, I remember it actually extremely distinctly, because I remember Callum Beaumont. So it was back in our SFU pipe band days, and I remember Callum Beaumont had just joined the band, and we were at some event where we were all playing solos, and Callum, of course, just destroyed the entire field. He was
that makes sense, sure.
He was like 4'1", and like the classic Callum Beaumont, just like, I don't know. He would be mad if I said this, so I'm not gonna. No, I'll say it. Like, it's got that baby face, just like Callum. And so super young, an amazing, incredible player, but like he just came up and like ran the show. Yeah. And then I thought I had a good tune, and I was just interested on how things compared. And like Jack's like main criticism to me was like how I was presenting myself while I was tuning.
Really?
He was like, yeah, he was picking apart like my tuning regime, because of course at the high levels, that first impression is really important. And even though it's not going to factor in officially to the result, just how you present yourself as a competitor and how you present yourself during that tuning period is kind of important. And I would definitely recommend, even at the lower levels, make sure that you practice what your tuning plan is going to be. Yeah, because
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
because that first impression really matters.
So would you say, like, generally it's a good idea to take your full allotted amount of time? Or would you just say, like, play till you feel like it's settled and then go for it, because it's not going to stay settled forever?
Okay, great question. Well, what level are we talking about?
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, how about me, grade 3? Well,
grade 3?
Yeah.
So by grade 3, you definitely want to be... See, let's actually... we'll just start with beginners.
Give me a spectrum.
Okay?
Yeah, start with the beginner.
Yeah, my advice to beginners is don't do any tuning. And I can amend that. I can amend that momentarily. But like, so if you're at the beginner entry level, the best thing you could possibly do is have an expert help you get tuned up, and then when it's your turn to compete, you walk up to the table, introduce yourself to the judge, and then when he says go, like strike up your pipes. Maybe play a couple of notes and just make sure everything is feeling good, and then just start your tune and don't worry about tuning at all.
But definitely, as you say, rehearse that couple of notes before so you know what you're going to do when you tune.
Right, exactly. But, at the absolute entry level, if you can get an expert to help you get tuned up, the odds that settling period is going to help you are pretty low, right? Because as a beginner, tuning is a really difficult thing to do. And so if we can not focus on that and instead focus on the quality of the tune, that's what I would recommend. Now, I've heard like Stuart Little say, with some of his students, that he would get them all tuned up and then he would purposefully detune one drone. So then the student would go up in front of the judge, introduce themselves, and they'd strike up, but they wouldn't be quite in tune. But then they could just practice moving that one drone and just sort of practice starting to feel comfortable tuning yourself in front of the judge. All that stuff sounds really good to me. But we want to minimize
like it would impress the judge too, especially at a beginner stage. Like the judge would go, "Oh, good job!" Like not marking it down right, but it's definitely thinking like this guy. Oh, all right,
right, exactly. And it's all about that first impression for sure. So like all that stuff sounds like fair game to me. But as a beginner, we would want to do the absolute minimum in order to get our pipes sounding good. And I would not, as a judge, I prefer to not sit for 3 minutes while someone is tuning their pipes, but it's clear that they don't really have like an established skill set there yet.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't seem necessary to me. But some people will do that because they've been told you should use your whole tuning time.
I've put some judges through torture like that before myself.
Right, exactly. And I think I have too. And by the way, you're always going to have the occasional performance where you use the whole time and you just never manage to quite get your pipes locked in the way that you want. And that's life.
Yeah, that's like every time.
Yeah, or every time maybe for others. But that's something we want to work on. And again, if it really is every time, that's when you want to bring in a consultant. Like I highly recommend players of almost all levels, like even all the way up to grade 1. Possibly even into professional, like why can't one professional ask another, like, hey, like, what do you think about this? And, usually in the spirit of good sounding pipes, everybody will be willing to like, give you a tip or two if they're finding a detail that you're not hearing. Like it's all fair game and you should definitely do that. I see a lot of competitors, especially in the lower grades, they show up with no one there to help them, and who's going to win that competition? It's like the person who has the people there to help them.
Right. Their pipe major, their tutor, or somebody there to help.
Yeah. And then as you get more advanced, so like you say, let's say grade 3, we definitely want to have a tuning routine that we go through, and we want to have an evaluation process. So, once we start up our pipes, maybe play one part of a slow air and then compare our low A to the drones and make a nice decision and retune things as needed. And then when you get to the super high levels, like when you watch the Glenfiddich, I think they have an extra minute to tune at the Glenfiddich because it's that beneficial for those players to really be able to think through their instrument and how and whether or not it's really settled before they begin.
What if a soloist were to stand up and just like do just like a complete flex, right? And just like play a face melting wild solo before they even solo. Is that too much, or is that a really great idea for somebody to try?
It kind of reminds me of like, it's kind of like if you went to like a really expensive restaurant, like and where like the main, where like it was like a set menu, like that new movie called The Menu. We just watched that. Like all this fancy food with like the foam, like the lobster foam and like all those fancy ingredients. But then before anybody even came to greet you, like after you sat down at the table, before the waiter even came over to like give you the menu, someone just slapped like a Five Guys cheeseburger down there.
Just like,
or like even where like, no, let's go with like a Whopper. Let's go with like a Whopper with cheese.
Even better. Yeah. Like still in
like
the wrapper.
A Whopper with cheese. Yeah. A Whopper with cheese is delicious, but it destroys the vibe of what comes after.
Gotcha.
And so, so you wouldn't want that at a fancy restaurant that you were, going to strictly so that you could experience the quality. So you wouldn't want that here either. So whatever you play during that tuning settling period, okay, and whatever you play should be complementary and shouldn't steal the show from what's to come. So sometimes you'll just hear pipers play kind of mostly random notes. And there's something to be said for that. Every time you say that,
I want to make a P-Brook joke.
Right, like P-Rock is random notes.
Right, play some random notes and be like, that was a P-Brook, actually.
But it's not. And so, you'll hear top players kind of, they have what they do. Sometimes it's like, along the same lines. It's like some people will even say they don't like to hear slow airs before a P-Brock, right? Because it's like de-cleansing the palate. So at the top levels, you'll often hear pipers play a couple of abbreviated variations of a P-Brock just because it tends to be like least disturbing to the palate. But again, that's high end stuff.
Right.
If you're in grade 3, playing one part of a slow air and then reaching up and double checking the tuning of the drones, like I think that's probably fine. But yeah, it gets towards the higher levels, it gets weirder and people have stranger preferences.
Yeah.
And as we were mentioning before, it's like it might play into the strategy of how you're going to attempt to win the contest, just how you present yourself in that first couple minutes.
So what about that third bucket when it comes to like the tune? I'm assuming that might include like mostly like maybe it's mostly like musical expression, like the way you execute the tune. But does that also like maybe it's kind of like judging you before your judging period actually starts? But like, how much does tune selection matter? Like should we be
During
researching our judges? No, I'm like first bucket being finger work, second bucket being your instrument and how you play it, and then third bucket being the musicality of it or something like that, right? Like maybe that's a more ephemeral section, but it matters, right? And like I'm just thinking like, is it just you played Dark Isle really, really well? Or is it also that judge, their first solo piece was Dark Isle, and so they really love that you played it? Or they think you didn't play it right, and so, you set yourself at a disadvantage. So
I think a good judge, has zero bias as to, what tunes you select. But it's a nuanced issue, right? Like let's say Jim shows up and he plays a tune that's way too hard for him, right? And then the other guy shows up and he's not as good a player as Jim, but he played a simple tune well instead of a tune that was too hard for him, not particularly well, right? And then so now you have to take the tune selection into account when you determine the result. So it's not like purely black and white.
Yeah.
But in general, and what I try to do as a judge is I try to not let my bias, like tunes I particularly like versus ones I don't particularly like. I try not to let that factor into the result. And so I think you'll find most judges are the same. But then sometimes it's just not possible. Like some people, when you play Unjust Incarceration, if you play it even remotely well, that that person's going to win it just because it's that's a famous tune that everybody loves. And if you pull it off, it's going to be tough to beat. There are definitely those types of tunes out there. Mm-hmm. So the short answer is no, it won't factor into the result. But the longer answer is it probably does.
Yeah. What is that? Long answer, yes, with an if. Short answer, no, with a but.
Right. Exactly.
I think that was Reverend Lovejoy, something along those lines.
Yeah. But that's the, and that's sort of the name of the game.